My hands won't stop shaking. Not from the cold. Not from the blood drying along my jaw. They're shaking because I just did the most dangerous thing a woman like me can do. I ran straight toward the monster instead of away from him. And the worst part? Standing here in this Raleigh alley, barefoot on wet cobblestone, staring up at a man whose eyes don't catch the light the way human eyes should, I don't think I made a mistake. My father sold me. My brother held me down while they made the call. And then, to make sure I wouldn't fight it, they said a name. His name. Like it was a door being locked from the outside. So I ran here, because if they were going to use him against me, I wanted to look at him myself. If something in that cracked something open in you, stay.
Subscribe.
This is where those stories live. When the vampire king saw me crumpled at the mouth of the alley behind his Raleigh stronghold, he didn't move. His guard was already closing the distance. A broad-shouldered man named Pell, hand inside his jacket, body angled to remove me like I was a problem that had wandered in from the street. Which, to be fair, I had. I was barefoot. My dress was torn at the shoulder. There was blood on my jaw from where the brick had caught me when I fell, and my left knee was bleeding through a cut I hadn't felt yet because my body had decided, very reasonably, that feeling things could wait. I pressed my hand to my chest, not reaching for anything, just checking, just making sure the heart behind my ribs was still mine. Pell was 3 feet away when the vampire king raised one hand. A single finger. Barely a gesture. Pell stopped like the ground had turned to glass beneath him. I lifted my head. He was standing at the far end of the alley in a white suit that had no business being that clean in a city like Raleigh at an hour like this. The amber light from the street behind him caught the edges of him and stopped there, like it knew better than to go further. His face gave away nothing. Not curiosity. Not impatience. Not the particular kind of male assessment I had learned to brace for, the one that calculated worth in seconds and always came up short.
He was simply looking at me.
And I realized, with a clarity that cut through everything else, the pain, the cold, the 3 hours of running, that no one had simply looked at me in a very long time. Not without agenda. Not without ownership already assumed. I should have been more afraid. I had been told to be more afraid. Arthur Sinclair will not be defied. That's what my father had said, standing in our kitchen with his arms crossed and his eyes somewhere past my left shoulder, because he had never once in my life looked at me directly when he was taking something from me. Arthur Sinclair guarantees this arrangement. You run. You're not just running from me. You're running from something 300 years old that doesn't forget and doesn't stop. He had said the name like a cage door closing. So here I was, inside the cage. Choosing it. I opened my mouth. My voice came out steadier than I deserved. My father and my brother did this. I held his gaze. Those eyes that didn't catch light the way human eyes should, that seemed instead to absorb it, to file it away, to use it for something later. They sold me to a man named Odin Jesuit to clear a debt. $600,000.
A breath.
And they used your name to make sure I wouldn't run. The alley went very quiet. Not the quiet of absence. The quiet of a room where something large and old and patient has just been given a reason to pay attention. Arthur Sinclair looked at me for a long moment. 3 seconds. 4. In the image of him that would live in me long after this night, crouching down, unhurried, the white of his suit a stark, impossible thing against the wet brick and the dark, what struck me wasn't power. It wasn't danger, though both were present in the way pressure is present before a storm. It was the stillness. He wasn't performing his reaction. He wasn't calculating how to appear. He was simply deciding, with the patience of something that had made 10,000 decisions before this one, and understood that most of them couldn't be undone. He descended into a crouch. Not close enough to touch me. close enough that I could see his eyes clearly now, and what I saw in them wasn't warmth, wasn't softness, wasn't the particular brand of pity that people aim at broken things. It was recognition, like something in him had filed the shape of this moment under familiar. Under this again. Under someone always thinks they can use what is mine. Who heard him say my name? He asked. His voice was quiet, controlled. The voice of a man who had learned centuries ago that volume was for people who needed to be believed. I told him. Every name. Every room. He listened without moving, without interrupting, without the small, impatient shifts that men make when they've already decided what they're going to do and are simply waiting for you to finish speaking. When I was done, he stood. He looked at Pell. Bring the car, he said. Open the east wing. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to mean something. And find me everything that exists on Odin Jesuit. All of it.
He looked back at me then.
One last time before things changed. You can stand, he said, or I can have someone assist you. But you're coming inside. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a command either, not exactly. It was something rarer, an assumption of my capacity, offered cleanly, without softening it into something small. I stood on my own, and I followed the Vampire King into the light. The room they put me in wasn't a guest room.
It was something older than that.
High ceilings, dark wood, a window that looked out over Raleigh's old city district where the streets still remembered being cobblestone underneath the asphalt. Someone had left a glass of water on the side table and a folded blanket on the chair, and both gestures were so quietly human that they made my throat close in a way the violence hadn't. I sat on the edge of the chair. I didn't touch the blanket. A woman named Corvin brought a first aid kit without being asked and cleaned the cut on my jaw with steady, wordless hands. She didn't look at me with pity. She looked at me the way a person looks at a problem they intend to solve, and I found that easier to accept than kindness would have been. Kindness would have broken something. Competence I could receive without coming apart. Arthur came in when she left. No knock. But he paused in the doorway long enough that it functioned as one, long enough for me to understand that he was giving me the choice of the room, the choice of the air, the choice of how close he came. He moved to a chair across from mine and sat, and the distance between us was exactly what it needed to be. Not intimate, not cold, calibrated.
Tell me, he said. So I did.
I had rehearsed versions of this story in my head during the 3 hours I ran. Edited versions. Strategic versions. The version that made me sound less like someone who had spent 20 years not seeing what was directly in front of her. But sitting in that room, in that particular quality of stillness that Arthur Sinclair seemed to generate simply by existing, I found that the edited versions wouldn't come. What came instead was the truth, in the order it happened, without the protective distance I'd been constructing since I climbed out of that bathroom window. My father's debt to Odin Jesuit. $600,000. It started with a warehouse arrangement, stolen cargo, fenced electronics, the kind of mid-level criminality that men like my father convince themselves is temporary, a bridge, something they'll step off of before it collapses. The shipment was intercepted. The debt transferred to my father personally. And Odin Jesuit, who had never wanted money, who had structured the repayment terms to be impossible by design, waited. My father's solution arrived on a Tuesday. I came home to find my brother Taft in the living room. My suitcase was already packed. It was sitting by the door like a verdict that had been delivered while I was out, like the conversation had been held without me because my presence in it was irrelevant. Taft was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, and my father was standing in the center of the room with the particular stillness of a man who has already made peace with what he is about to do. He didn't look at me. He explained it to the floor. The marriage contract had been drawn up. My signature line was blank, which wasn't an oversight. It was a statement. My name would go there when someone decided it would, and my consent was not the mechanism by which that would happen. I said no. My father continued talking. I said it again, louder, and took a step toward the door, and that was when Taft moved. My brother, who I had defended once to a boy at school who called him a coward. My brother, whose childhood nightmares I had sat up through because our mother was gone and someone had to. He crossed the room in 3 steps and took hold of my arms from behind and held me still, and he held me with the full strength of someone who had made a decision about what I was worth, and the decision was less than $600,000. My father picked up his phone and called Odin Jesuit to say the arrangement was confirmed. I told Arthur all of it. The contract, the phone call, the way Taft's hands felt on my arms, not cruel, which would have been easier, but careful, the way you hold something you're handing off and don't want damaged before delivery. And then I told him the last part. The part one had been carrying the heaviest. When I stopped fighting, not because I gave up, but because I was calculating, because I was already looking for the window, my father said one more thing. He said it the way men say things they believe are final. Like pronouncements. Like geography. Arthur Sinclair guarantees this arrangement, he said. You understand what that means. You understand what he is. You run, and you're not just running from this family. You're running from something that was old before this city existed. And it will find you. He said the name like a door being locked from the outside. And the room where I now sat, in the compound of the man whose name had been used to cage me, went very quiet. Arthur hadn't moved. Not once during the full hour I spoke. He sat with his hands folded, his eyes on me, and he listened with the complete attention of someone who understood that interrupting a woman telling the truth about the worst night of her life was a form of violence he would not commit. When I finished, the silence held for a long moment. Then he asked his question. How many people, he said, his voice exactly as controlled as it had been in the alley, exactly as quiet, carrying underneath it something that was not quite anger, because anger in Arthur Sinclair didn't announce itself. It simply reorganized. Heard him say my name? I looked at him across the distance he had chosen and kept. And I understood for the first time that I had not run toward danger. I had run toward the only force in Raleigh capable of making my father regret the word he had spoken. I gave him the number. He nodded once and reached for phone. He made 3 calls that night. I know because I was still in the chair when he made them, and he didn't ask me to leave, which I understood was its own kind of statement. He spoke in low, unhurried sentences. No raised voice. No urgency performed for my benefit. Just information moving through channels that had clearly been open for a very long time, in the direction of people who knew better than to need things repeated. I watched him the way you watch something you don't have a category for yet. I had known angry men my whole life. My father's anger was a weather system. It built slowly, announced itself with silence, and broke without warning. Taft's anger was simpler, louder, the kind that needed a target and didn't much care which one. Even Odin Jesuit, who I had only met once in my own living room, carried his anger visibly, the way men carry things they want you to notice. Arthur Sinclair's anger was none of those things. It had no weather. It made no sound. It simply arrived as a shift in the quality of the air around him, a drop in temperature so subtle you felt it in your spine before your skin registered it, and then it went somewhere internal, somewhere architectural, and became structure. Became planning, became the patient, methodical construction of a response that would outlast any room it was built in. By midnight, there were people in this city moving because he had spoken. I didn't know their names.
I didn't ask.
I sat with the water I had finally drunk and the blanket I had finally pulled around my shoulders, and I watched Arthur Sinclair dismantle the first layer of what my father had built, and I felt something shift in my chest that I didn't have a clean word for. It wasn't safety. I had learned too young that safety was a story people told themselves in the dark. It wasn't gratitude, though that was present too. It was something closer to recognition. The recognition of watching someone treat your situation as a thing that matters, as a problem worth the full weight of their attention, as something real. I had not been treated as something real in a very long time. On the second day, they found us. Or rather, they found the edges of where we were. Odin's men didn't come to the compound. They appeared in the streets around it, in the old city district where Raleigh's history sits heaviest in the architecture, where the buildings remember what they were before the city grew up around them. 2 men in a car on Blunt Street. 1 man on foot near the market, asking questions with his hands in his jacket. Pell told me quietly, the way you tell someone something you've already decided they can handle. I thanked him and went to find Arthur. He already knew. Of course he already knew. He was standing at the window in his study, looking out at the street below with the stillness of something that had been watching cities for 3 centuries and understood that the way a man stands on a corner reveals everything about who sent him. "They're looking for me," I said. Not a question. "They're confirming you're here," he said. "There's a difference. Looking implies doubt. They were told where you came. They're verifying." Which meant my father had told Odin where I ran. I sat with that for a moment, the specific weight of it. Not the betrayal, I had processed that or begun to, but the precision of it. My father hadn't just sold me and let go. He was still participating, still cooperating, still handing me over in installments, hoping that full compliance might buy him something. I pressed my hand flat against the doorframe, checking for solid ground. "What happens to them?" I asked. "The men outside." Arthur turned from the window. He looked at me with those eyes that absorbed light and returned nothing, and he said, "2 of them won't leave Raleigh." He said it the way you state a fact about weather. Matter of fact. Irrevocable. Not cruel. Cruelty requires enjoyment, and there was no enjoyment in him. There was only arithmetic. A calculation performed across centuries of understanding what happened when messages were left soft. "And the others?" I asked. "The others go back," he said, carrying something for Odin to think about. I didn't ask what they would carry. I understood, in the way that you understand things you have always known but were never supposed to say out loud, that what they carried was fear. Specifically calibrated. Specifically addressed. The kind of fear that arrives not as violence but as the understanding that violence is available and has been chosen against for now as a courtesy that can be withdrawn. The kind of fear that makes men like Odin Jesuit lie awake and recalculate. That night I found Arthur in the library. He was standing at a shelf, running one finger along the spine of a book in a language I didn't recognize, something old, the letters shaped like nothing modern. He didn't hear me come in, or he chose not to react, and I stood in the doorway for a moment just watching the gesture. How careful it was. How almost tender. The way you touch something you are afraid of losing. "You've done this before," I said quietly. "Dismantled someone." He didn't turn around. "Many times," he said. "Does it get easier?" A pause. The length of something being considered, honestly. "It gets cleaner," he said. "Easier is a different question." I stood there in the library doorway with the warm light behind him and the old books around us, and the sounds of Raleigh outside, muffled and ordinary, and I thought about what it must cost to be 300 years of cleaner without ever arriving at easier. And something in me, very quietly, began to ache for him. Not yet. Not loudly. Just a small seam, opening. I have a habit I've never told anyone about. Every room I've ever been put in, and there have been many in the 20 years of my life, rooms I was expected to stay in, rooms that were decided for me before I arrived, I test. Not dramatically. I don't rattle the handle or pound on the door. I simply walk to it, slowly, the way you approach something you suspect might be wired and I try it.
Just to know.
Just to establish the truth of my situation before I make any other decision. Most of the time it was locked. Not always with a key. Sometimes with expectation. Sometimes with the particular silence of a house that had agreed, without discussion, that Nellie Emile did not require a door that opened. On the third morning in Arthur's compound, I walked to the front door. It opened. Cold air came through immediately, Raleigh in the early hours, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and something blooming somewhere in the dark, something that had decided spring was worth attempting regardless of what the temperature said. The street beyond was quiet. Amber streetlight on cobblestone. A car moving slowly 2 blocks south, its headlights sweeping the old brick buildings like a question. I stood in the doorway for a long time. No hand on my shoulder. No voice behind me. No sound of footsteps adjusting, repositioning, preparing to intercept. The compound simply held its breath and let me stand at its open mouth and decide. I thought about running.
I want to be honest about that.
The reflex was there, the old animal calculation, the one I'd been running on for 3 days, the one that said move, keep moving, stillness is how they catch you. My bare feet remembered cobblestone. My body remembered the alley. 20 years of being managed had built an exit instinct so deep it had its own heartbeat. But underneath that, something else. The water glass left without being asked. Corvin's steady, wordless hands. A blanket folded on a chair. Arthur in the library, touching the spine of an old book like it was the only thing in the room that understood him. It gets cleaner. Easier is a different question. I thought about the last door that had opened for me. Our house. Taft behind me. My father on the phone. The difference between a door that opens to release you and a door that opens to let you choose. I had never, in 20 years, been given the second kind. I stood in the open doorway of Arthur Sinclair's compound and felt the full impossible weight of an unlocked door, and my eyes burned in a way I refused to process, and then I stepped back inside and closed it behind me. The choice surprised me more than running would have. I went to the library because it was the only room in the compound that felt like it had been lived in rather than maintained. The other rooms were immaculate in a way that suggested care without occupation, surfaces clean, proportions considered, everything in its right place, without the comfortable disorder of a life actually being led. But the library had been used. Books pulled and replaced at angles. A cup ring on the side table from something that had sat there long enough to leave a mark. That shelf of unreadable languages, the spines bent just slightly on 3 of them, the way you bend a spine when the words inside are still relevant. I took a book from the English shelf, Contract Law, which made me almost smile, and sat in the chair by the window and didn't read a word of it. I heard him before I saw him. Not footsteps. Arthur Sinclair didn't announce himself with footsteps, didn't shift air the way human presence shifts air. What I heard was the quality of the room changing, a kind of density arriving, a gravitational adjustment that my body registered before my mind caught up.
He stood in the doorway.
He took in the open book in my lap, the fact that I hadn't turned a page. You tested the door, he said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't an accusation. It was the tone of someone stating an observation they found neither surprising nor troubling, just true. I always do, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed the room and sat in the chair across from mine, and the distance between us was the same distance as always, the one that had been present since the alley, measured and maintained with a consistency I had begun to notice the way you notice a pattern only after it's repeated enough times to become something intentional. And, he said, it opened. Yes. You knew I would test it.
I assumed, he said.
I looked at him across the distance. And you left it unlocked anyway. Something moved across his face. Not a smile. Too restrained for that, too careful. But a shift, A minute recalibration of whatever Arthur Sinclair kept his expression set to when he was in a room with another person. "Where you stay," he said quietly, "should be a choice you make every morning, not a condition you accepted once and can't revisit." The book in my lap suddenly felt very heavy. I had spent 20 years in rooms where staying was the only option, and the architecture of that, the way it had settled into my bones, the way I had stopped even mentally reaching for doors, rose up in me all at once, and I pressed my hand flat against the cover of the contract law book and breathed through it. He didn't fill the silence. He understood, I think, that some silences aren't empty. Some silences are a person reassembling themselves quietly, in the presence of someone they have decided, slowly, without announcement, to trust. When I looked up, he was still there. Still at the measured distance. Still not looking away. And the distance between us, I realized, had not changed by a single inch.
But the nature of it had.
It was no longer the distance of a stranger's careful management. It was the distance of two people who had both, without saying so, decided to stay. It started on a Wednesday. Quietly. That's the thing no one tells you about watching something ancient exercise its full power. You expect noise. You expect spectacle, the kind of destruction that announces itself, that wants to be witnessed, that needs an audience to feel complete. That's the human version of power. The version I had grown up around. My father's version. Odin Jesuit's version. Power as performance. Power as volume. Arthur's version was different. It began with a single phone call on Wednesday morning, made from the study while I sat in the library pretending to read. By Thursday, I heard through Pell that 2 of Odin's warehouse leases in the South District had been quietly transferred to new ownership, not seized, not raided, simply moved, the way you move a piece on a board, without drama, while your opponent is still studying a different part of the game. By Friday, the silence from my father's side of the city had changed texture. I know the difference between the silence of someone waiting and the silence of someone who has just understood what they are inside of. My father had stopped calling my phone, which he had been doing 3 times a day, with the persistence of a man who believes that repetition is the same as power. The calls simply stopped, like a door closing from the inside. That silence told me more than any update could. I did not watch most of it. This was a choice I made deliberately, the way I had chosen to come back through the compound door, the way I had chosen to stay. I had spent 20 years being managed by other people's decisions, and there was a version of me that wanted to track every move, monitor every development, refused to look away from a single moment of what was being done on my behalf. A clenched-jawed, white-knuckled version that needed to witness the destruction in order to believe it was real. But I was tired of that version of myself. So I let Arthur work, and I rebuilt myself in the library, and I tested the front door every morning, and I breathed. Corvin told me, on the 5th day, about Taft. She sat across from me at the kitchen table with her steady hands folded and told me simply, without cruelty, that my brother's name had been submitted to a federal contractor fraud database. That the company he'd been using to move money, a small import business he'd built quietly over 3 years, the one thing he'd done entirely on his own, had been dissolved overnight. That his photograph and a detailed account of the night he held my arms while my father made the call had been delivered to every professional contact in his network. Not violence. Erasure. The methodical, permanent kind that follows a person for years, that closes doors before they can be reached, that turns a name into a liability in every room it enters.
I sat with that for a long time.
I want to be honest again. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like grief. The particular grief of watching someone you once loved, someone whose nightmares you sat up through, whose childhood you shared a wall with, become exactly the thing that deserved what was happening to them. The grief of a before and after that can never be reconciled, of a brother who existed once, and a man who replaced him, and the absence of any clear moment when one became the other. I pressed my hand to my chest. Old habit. Still mine. Odin Jesuit was brought to a room on a Tuesday. I know only the outline. Arthur told me what he believed I needed to know, which was not everything, and I accepted that boundary the way I had accepted the unlocked door, as a form of respect rather than withholding. Some rooms are not mine to enter. Some knowledge sits in the body wrong, takes up space that could be used for something else. What I know is this. Odin Jesuit, who had never accepted loss, who had structured his entire operation around the principle that nothing taken from him could be reclaimed, walked into a room in Raleigh's Old City district at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday. Arthur was already inside. No guards. No Pell. No performance of power through assembled bodies and visible weapons. Just Arthur, and a table, and the particular atmosphere of a man who has been alive for 300 years and has run completely out of patience. I don't know the full contents of what was said, but Odin Jesuit left that room 2 hours later, and the man who left it was not the man who had entered. I know this because Corvin described his face, and the face she described was the face of someone who had been shown something so complete, so irrevocable, so far beyond the boundaries of what he had believed was possible that the architecture of his confidence had simply given way. Not broken. Collapsed inward. The way a building demolishes itself when the thing holding it upright is removed. His network followed within the week. Not dramatically, just the quiet, inexorable unraveling of something that had been depending on fear to hold its shape, and had just discovered that the thing it was afraid of had been afraid of nothing the entire time. Arthur came to the library that night. He sat in his chair. I sat in mine. The distance between us was chosen, same as always, same as every night now, and I looked at him across it, and I asked the only question that mattered. Is it done? The necessary part, he said. What's left? He looked at me for a long moment. Something in his expression that I was only beginning to learn how to read, the tectonic version of a feeling, deep and slow and irreversible. That, he said quietly, depends on you. He called me into the study on a Thursday morning. Not the library, where we had built our careful evenings of chosen distance and borrowed silence. The study, his room, his desk, the place where 300 years of accumulated decision-making lived in the grain of the wood and the weight of the air. I had been in it only once before, the night he made the first calls. I remembered how the room felt then, like standing at the edge of something vast and looking down. It felt the same now. But I was not the same person who had stood there before. He was at the desk when I entered. A single document in front of him, and beside it, a leather portfolio that I recognized as the kind that Corvin carried when things had been finalized, when the decisions had already been made, and what remained was only the question of acceptance. He looked up, gestured to the chair across from him. I sat. He didn't open with explanation. Arthur never opened with explanation. He opened with truth, unadorned, and let you find your footing in it. Odin Jesuit's operation has been restructured, he said. The network he controlled, supply chains, city contracts, 3 legitimate front businesses, and the underground reach that kept Raleigh's lower districts manageable, all of it is now vacant. The people who ran it for him are either gone or looking for new allegiances. He paused. Power in a city doesn't disappear when one person loses it. It transfers. The only question is to whom. He turned the portfolio toward me and opened it. I looked at what was inside for a long time without speaking. Organizational charts, account structures, contact lists. A network so carefully assembled it looked less like a criminal operation than like an infrastructure. The kind of thing that a city runs on without knowing it, that keeps certain wheels turning, that sits underneath the visible world like foundations nobody sees but everybody stands on. All of it Every piece of it had my name at the top. My hands were very still in my lap. "You're giving me his seat," I said. "I'm giving you what was built on your cost," he said. "That's different." I looked up at him. "Why?" I asked. The word came out quiet, stripped of everything except its own weight. Not "why are you doing this" in the suspicious sense. Not "what do you want" in the transactional sense. Just why. The way you ask why when someone has done something so far outside your existing framework for what people do that your mind simply cannot process it without more information.
He didn't hesitate.
"Because they tried to make you into a transaction," he said. "A number. A line in a ledger that could be moved from one column to another without your knowledge or consent. And the most effective correction," his eyes held mine, steady and ancient and absolutely certain, "is not to punish the men who did it. It's to make you into something they have to answer to." The room was very quiet. I have heard a lot of things said to me in my 20 years. Things that were meant to comfort and landed as condescension. Things that were meant as love and arrived as control. Things spoken in the language of care that were actually the language of ownership, dressed up so carefully it took me years to hear the difference. I had never, not once in my life, heard someone speak my own potential back to me as a fact. Not a hope, not a consolation. A fact. Delivered without softness, without the padding of sentiment, in the flat, certain tone of someone stating what they had already decided was true. Something broke open in my chest. Not loudly. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't the collapse I might have expected after weeks of holding myself together with both hands.
It was quieter than that.
The way something breaks when it has been under pressure for so long that the breaking is almost a relief. A seam. A wall discovering it was tired. I pressed my hand flat against the portfolio. My name at the top of a structure built from the rubble of a man who had tried to purchase me. I thought about my mother, who I barely remembered but had been told was a woman who stayed in rooms she should have left. I thought about the suitcase by the door. I thought about Taft's hands on my arms and my father's voice on the phone, and 20 years of doors that only opened from the outside. I thought about a compound door swinging open at 3 a.m. with no one behind me. I closed the portfolio. "I'll take it," I said. The silence that followed was different from all the other silences we had built together in this house. Those had been silences of restraint, of careful distance, of two people managing the space between them with the precision of people who understood that what lived in that space was not nothing. This one was the silence of something that had been waiting. I looked at Arthur Sinclair across the desk, across the chosen distance, across 3 weeks of unlocked doors and library evenings, and the particular education of watching someone exercise power without cruelty, and I saw, for the first time clearly, what had been moving behind his eyes. It wasn't warmth. Not yet. Not the easy kind. It was something older and more dangerous than warmth. The look of a man who had spent 300 years being unmoved and had recently, without planning for it, been moved. "What do you want from me now?" I asked. The question sat between us like a lit match. Arthur was still for a long moment, long enough that I felt every second of it in my sternum. And then something shifted in his expression. That tectonic thing, deep and slow and irreversible, the kind of change that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. "I want," he said carefully, like a man selecting words from a language he is not accustomed to speaking, "to find out who you become. Not what you owe me. Not what I've earned. Not the language of transaction that every other man in my life had defaulted to when they wanted something. Who you become." The snow from the night I arrived had been gone for weeks. Raleigh outside was warm now, lit. The streets carrying that particular late spring energy of a city that has survived its own winter and is quietly, without ceremony, beginning again. I had come into this city running. I had come through that alley with blood on my jaw and my father's debts on my back and a name in my mouth that I had aimed like a weapon because it was the only one I had. I was not running anymore. I was sitting in a chair in a room that understood power, across from a man 3 centuries old who had just told me he wanted to watch me become something, and the distance between us was chosen, had always been chosen, and it was smaller than it had ever been. There are women who find their way to stories like this one, who recognize something in the alley, even if their alley had a different name. If that's you, if some part of tonight felt like it was written in a language you already spoke, this is where those stories live.
Subscribe. Stay.
Because this is only the beginning of what Nellie Emile becomes. And I don't want you to miss it. The city hummed outside. And somewhere in Arthur Sinclair's ancient, carefully controlled expression, something that looked almost like anticipation had begun, quietly and irrevocably, to take up residence.
This was not the end.
It was the first real sentence of something else entirely.